multi-story building here in downtown Houston once housed Enron. For 6 consecutive years, it was named America's most innovative company. Success was in the air. Thousands who worked here thought they had billions in assets. But suddenly, it was revealed that Enron had nothing. Nada. And after a thorough investigation, 21 executives were imprisoned. 4,000 lost their jobs and life savings. And Enron was dubbed as arguably the biggest company collapse in history. Now, they thought they were winning, but they were losing. What happened? And how can we avoid thinking we are progressing, but in reality, we are regressing? What potholes to avoid? Good morning, my friend. If you are new to Mosaic Church, welcome back to our series, From Stressed to Blessed. There are 14 nuggets from the book of Judges that will transform you from a stressed life into a blessed one. Today, we will learn to avoid converting God's blessings into cursing. So let's open our Bibles to Judges chapter 3, verses 12 to 31, as we discover the third nugget to stay blessed, not stressed. Similar to the last video, we will see 3 things: a problem, a solution, and an application. But let me give the context first. The story begins with the death of Othniel, the first judge, the exemplar. Immediately after his death, Israel quickly declined into this downward spiral by following these 5 disastrous steps. Numero uno, sin. Twice in Judges 3:12, it says, "And the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, because they had done what was evil in the sight of the Lord." Twice, because they seemed they could not stop. Numero dos, servitude to their enemy. 3:12 continues, "And the Lord strengthened Eglon, a very fat king, the king of Moab, against Israel." Unimaginable. God blessing and strengthening your wicked enemy? 3:12 adds, "And the people of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. Third, supplication for God to help them. 3:15 says, "Then the people of Israel cried out to the Lord." Unfortunately, this cry is out of distress, not out of repentance. But God in His mercy gave them numero 4, salvation. 3:15 continues, "And the Lord raised up for them a deliverer, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man." Result? Numero 5, silence. Because Ehud killed Eglon and led Israel to kill 10,000 Moabites, Israel experienced silence. 3:30 says, "And the land had rest for 80 years. I wish that's the end of the story. But then, Ehud caused a problem that made their success pale in comparison with the losses they incurred afterward. They won the war, but lost the battle. It's 1 step forward, but 2 steps backward. Now, what did Ehud do? And how can we avoid the same problem? So let's start with the problem. Are you ready? The problem? Vain gain. Vain gain. It's a gain, but vain. Like Enron, you might think you are advancing, but in reality, regressing. There are 3 signs that God or Yahweh was not pleased with Ehud's success. Now, the first sign is the silence of God. Immediately after Yahweh raised up Ehud, there was no more involvement of Yahweh with the rest of the pericope. For example, normally whenever the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge. But with Ehud, we are not told that the Lord was with him, nor the Spirit came upon him, as with Othniel in 3:10. Nada. Even the victory Ehud won is not described in verses 29 to 30 as the work of Yahweh. Now, how did this happen? He relied on himself. The author uses the reflexive pronoun for himself to point out that God was not needed in his plans. 3:16 says, and Ehud made for himself a sword. Self-reliance. He doesn't need God. His theme song, I did it my way. That's why it's a vain gain, a sour success. The second sign is that the heart of the pericope, the killing of Eglon, is bracketed left and right with the mention of idols. It's the author's way of saying Ehud's actions are not from Yahweh, but from idolatrous mentality. On his way to kill is Judges 3:19. But he himself turned back at the idols near Gilgal. And then he killed Eglon. On his way from his kill is 3:26. Ehud escaped while they delayed, and he passed beyond the idols and escaped to Sarah. Now, why are these idols become markers in the story? Because idolatry permeates his thinking. No wonder the victory is a tragedy. The third sign is the description left-handed. 3:15 says, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjaminite, a left-handed man. Now, why mention this detail? Now, being left-handed is not wrong, but it was used as a literary device to describe his deception. In 3:20 to 21, Ehud used the name of God to trick Eglon. It says, and Ehud said, I have a message from God for you. And he, that's Eglon, arose from his seat. And Ehud reached with his left hand, took the sword from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. Result? Eglon was killed. But this prosperity eventually led to tragedy because it was based on trickery. Deception is not God's method. Well, that's what happened to Enron. In the beginning, it was indeed successful, but then it began to use accounting fraud. Well, that's just a code word for deception, to pretend it had more money than it did. Deception might give you instant success, but show a lack of dependence upon God. Again, you might get the victory, but it will cost you. Why? Because God is not pleased. So what areas are you using deception or self-reliance and syncretism in your life right now? Now listen, this pericope tells us it's not worth it. It's a vain gain. Like the vicious cycle in the entire Judges. It's one step forward, but two steps backward. So what's the solution so we won't repeat the same mistake? Now this brings us to the second point. Ready for it? The solution? Here it is. God's way, though embarrassing or ridiculous, is the best way. God's method works. This was proven by another judge or deliverer, Shamgar, the third judge on the list. Now let's look at his story. Now, Shamgar is portrayed here as a positive contrast against Ehud's negative character. Now, let's focus on the weapon God told him to use. Now, I'll warn you ahead of time, it's embarrassing. It's ridiculous. Now, let's read the only single verse containing Shamgar's resume. Judges 3:31 says, after him, or after Ehud's victory against Eglon's army, was Shamgar, the son of Anath, who killed 600 of the Philistines with an ox goad. And he also saved Israel. Now, did you notice Shamgar's weapon? An ox goad. This is a long, skinny stick with a pointy end that farmers used a long time ago to gently poke cows or oxen to make them move forward while plowing the fields. No one in his right mind will ever use an ox goad to battle. It's embarrassingly ridiculous. So why did Shamgar use it? Now, it can be inferred from the text that since he is the opposite of Ehud, who never asked God and instead resorted to self-reliance, duplicity, and idolatry, Shamgar asked God and led him to use this laughable weapon. But he trusted God's method. Result? He killed 600 Philistines. But this exploit is enough to frighten the living daylights out of the Philistines, so they never attack Israel again for the next 80 years. Now, did Shamgar feel embarrassed when he went to war with an ox goad? Probably, but he kept obeying God. He trusted God's method. He trusted God's process. Shamgar's experience is similar to Moses' embarrassing staff. But because this is God's method, Moses' staff devoured all the magician snakes. Moses' staff opened the 10 plagues in Egypt. And Moses' staff parted the Red Sea. Shamgar's experience is similar to Gideon's embarrassing 300 militia with no swords, but only trumpets, empty jars, and torches. But because this was God's method, they defeated the Midianites, which numbered hundreds of thousands. The point is this: God's method is the best. When I was a new pastor in my 20s, God directed me to start a church building project. Now, during that time in the Philippines, you could only acquire building permits if you bribe the officials. If you pay under the table, you will get everything fast, 2 to 3 months. But if you don't, you will keep waiting and keep going back in the next 2 to 3 years, and there's no assurance you will even get them. And everybody says, oh, just pay the grease money so that we will transfer from this dilapidated shack we call church into a ₱1,000,000 brand new church building. Honestly, I was tempted. But finally, I decided to follow God's way. I even bought a new pair of shoes because they will wear out going back and forth to follow God's way in the next 2 to 3 years. Well, the day finally came. I went to the city office and all the engineers looked at the designs and then looked at me, towering over me, expecting me to offer them money. So I offered them this. I squeaked embarrassingly and ridiculously, I am a pastor of the gospel. I will not give any of you money, and I bought these new shoes so that I can come back again and again, no matter how long it will take. They all look at me, and then they look at each other, and then they signed one by one, approving all the papers. Now, it was done in 2 to 3 minutes instead of 2 to 3 months or 2 to 3 years. And I was so sad because I left the office with my shoes still brand new. My point, God's way, though embarrassing and ridiculous is the best. So what's the application? Here's the third point. Remember this application. Ready? Nugget number 3. Trust God's process. Trust God's process. And be prepared to be surprised by God. Now, there are 3 practical ways to trust the process. First, trust God's process by knowing where God wrote His process. The Bible. Listen, almost exclusively, people think it's correct to practice syncretism or praying to God and idols and saints, or to practice self-reliance instead of waiting for God's revelation because they think it's in the Bible. But when they start reading the Bible, they discover such practices are abhorrent before God. So know where God wrote His process, the Bible. Now, second, you trust God's process by realizing that God's ways are higher than ours. God's thoughts are higher than our thoughts. Isaiah 55:8 and 9. No wonder to human logic, God seems ridiculous, embarrassing, illogical. But Shamgar has proven that God's way is better. Gideon, Moses, and Joshua have proven that God's way is better. I have repeatedly proven in my own life that God's way is the best. Third, trust God's process by just doing it without overthinking it. Listen, if you cheat on your exams, you will pass. Yay! But you will eventually pay for it. Don't be like Enron. Trust God's process. Now, if you buy your TV or car with God's money or tithe, yay, you will get it. But what will happen next? Don't do it. Trust God's process. You are aiming for a promotion, so you ask your friend to clock in for you while you were still driving in the parking lot. Don't be like Ehud. Trust God's process. Do things God's way. Your finances, your work, your love life, everything. And be prepared to be surprised by God. It's the best experience you will ever have.